We'd like to thank you for joining us on the what we're calling the Western story. And what we're endeavoring to do is to trace some of the things that make the Canada West a distinctive region. Canada West is a distinct society, if you will. What are some of our concerns? More importantly, what are some of our aspirations for the future that are a benefit to the West, but also a benefit to the entire country? We've done a podcast already kind of identifying some of the major concerns and aspirations. And I'm joined by my colleague, Marco Navarro-Jenny. And Marco, maybe you can kind of briefly summarize what we kind of got into on our last podcast. And then we have a special guest with us today that I want to introduce, but maybe you can start there, Marco, and then we'll get onto this later.
Sure, thank you. It's good to be back. We covered a few things, but the main theme in last podcast is that there is a certain sentiment in the West that it feels shackled, sometimes obstructed, sometimes taken for granted, certainly underrepresented in the institutions at the central government, and that these things are generating a series of aspirations. Westerners seek to have a recognition of a distinct identity inside the Federation. They would like to have freer trade. They would like to occupy greater constitutional space inside the Federation. They would like to see unobstructed corridors to have our goods.
And these are positive aspirations. These are not just complaints. These are aspirations.
Well, they are the result of a certain kind of uneasiness about being in the Federation. There may be complaints sometimes, but the vast majority of these things are certainly positive remedies that Western Canadians seek.
And we're going to be doing this series of podcasts dealing with some of these particular aspirations. For example, today we want to start on the subject of the recognition and treatment of the natural resource sectors, agriculture, energy, mining, forestry, and fisheries as fundamental building blocks of not just the Western economy, but the Canadian economy. And these are not relics from the past that Ottawa or Central Canada can afford to ignore or dismiss. But we have a special guest today, John Simpson. And John is the longtime CEO and president of the Cana Group of companies. But he's also very heavily involved in the agricultural sector, particularly the ranching sector. And he has very generously endowed a new research center at the University of Calgary called the Simpson Center, which is dedicated to doing research on agribusiness and agri-food. So we want to thank you for joining us, John, and eventually we want to get on to the agriculture sector, but maybe you'd like to say a little bit about our general theme as we're trying to identify these concerns and aspirations of Canada West that need to be dealt with and recognized in a better way than we have in the past. So over to you.
Thanks, Preston, and it's a pleasure to be here, and nice to meet you, Marco.
Thank you. Likewise.
It'll be an interesting discussion, and I put quite a bit of thought into how to respond to your questions. And I couldn't help but say to myself, I have to sort of set the stage as to what I think we as Canadians or as Western Canadians need to do to get our country back on track. And there's several significant issues, and I think they're too big for a small side of the country to do. I think they're going to take all of us, and it's going to take a big push to get that to happen. So let's start with the first one, I believe, is that we need a national energy program whereby we are self-sufficient in our energy, and we being all of Canada. We have the cleanest and the best oil and gas and production that's going on in the world today, and we're shipping more than 80% of it to the United States. And I'm kind of wondering, if it flows out of the ships that come in from the east, call it, into Toronto and Montreal, are they paying the full crude price? Or are they getting subsidized to have our Canadian Western prime price? I just wonder if that's an issue to talk about. in order to be self-sufficient, we absolutely must have transportation corridors. And in those transportation corridors have to be pipelines. Pipelines with oil and gas in them. And there has to be electrical transmission lines so we can move power east or west or wherever it needs to go. And once we get to that point where we have pipeline corridors moving crude and natural gas, that will relieve and alleviate the terrible blockage that we have in the rail system, east, west, and south. It's a 28-day turnaround for a rail unit to go from Hardisty to Houston. And we can pump that much in a pipeline in 24 hours.
This idea of moving large volumes of petroleum by rail car is, pipelines were invented to replace that.
And we're going further and further and further into moving it by rail, which is not safe. We've proven
the risks are much greater.
Yeah. So if we free up the Canadian rail system, east, west, and south, that's going to allow us to move grain. It's going to move products that can't go into pipelines in a more reasonable fashion. And that's going to take a huge investment in the pipelines, huge investment in improving the port system on the West Coast and in Toronto and in Montreal, all through the Great Lakes. There's a huge amount of money required.
And political action, because the biggest obstacles originally in building the CPR were physical and financial. The biggest obstacles today are political obstacles.
I feel like I'm becoming a fossil talking about a real pipeline that moves oil, but we have to have it. It has to happen. And I'm not convinced that Alberta alone or the West alone can do this, because we need to move this product across the nation. And I think that's very, very, very important. Some of the other issues that come and sort of trending towards agriculture, we need to manage our water systems better. In Alberta, there is an opportunity to increase our agriculture production by a huge amount. We're on the Alberta-Saskatchewan Water Agreement. We can absorb 50% of the water from the drainage basin of Alberta. We can use that. Each year we pass 80% of it through into Saskatchewan. So they use a unit called dams cubed. And it's a huge, 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 huge amount of water that we're just letting go down the river. That if we turned around, I mean, the provincial government has announced that they're going to put I spent $900 million in southern Alberta putting the irrigation canals underground. We need to spend that much money every year for 10 years and start to use our water to get it so that we can maximize our agricultural production.
Okay.
Temporary foreign workers. Both levels of the federal and the provincial government seem to be opposed to temporary foreign workers, but I believe each and every one of us is a foreign worker. None of us came from here, and we're all immigrants, and we have this ridiculousness where we think we have only Canada's where people are coming to look to work. It's not true. No. So that in the agricultural sector, we need 180,000 people a year to help us get our farming done. And both the Premier and the Prime Minister are saying, well, you're going to make your doctors and your lawyers and your engineers all come back to the farm and do the work. Not happening. It's just not happening. We have a large cattle ranch and a grain operation, and in the last 2 years, we've had one applicant who's got oil field experience. The rest of it are wannabes or young restaurant workers or kids that maybe grew up on a farm, can't get a job anywhere else, but it's not coming back from the patch. It's not coming from any doctors. It's not coming from the people that are unemployed who can't build cars anymore. Temporary foreign workers are a huge, huge, huge requirement. And we've done 3 papers at the Simpson Center on that with backed up, bona fide information on how much they're required. doesn't get in the system. And I think by now we all know that climate change is the elephant in the room. It's interesting to note that in Alberta, the statistical number in Alberta today is that there's 40,600 farms. And those farms cover approximately 50 million acres of farmland. Mm-hmm. And there's 150,000 people employed in that bubble, if you like. And it's interesting because I don't think you'd find another industry in Canada or anywhere else where all 150,000 of those people are trying to do the best they can. I wouldn't think that there's 100 bad farmers. They all go out, they all want to produce the best crops they can. They want to make as much money as they can. Yes, we're going to use pesticides. Yes, we're going to use fertilizer. But we're trying to feed the world. And that's our assignment. So we have to figure it out. And even more unique about that is probably half of those people, although they're working so hard to do carbon sequestration and control greenhouse gas emissions, don't believe in climate change at all. But they're still out there working hard. They're still out trying to make Alberta a better place in agriculture. We've done several papers on carbon and carbon sequestration and everything else. We just announced in a carbon program to the provincial government that Alberta is pretty low in its production of carbon and its greenhouse gas emission compared to the rest of the world. So the province like that is a starting point, because that's what they wanted to know about. Where do we really stand today in our carbon?
In relation to the rest of the world.
In relation to the rest of the world. So that's the Alberta that I know, and that's the Canada that I know. And I still, my heart flutters when I see the Canadian flag blowing in the wind. So, and I have a blue flag too.
Well, you've covered a number of things that we actually want to get into further: the corridor question, the balance between the economy and the environment, the infrastructure questions. But let's now, given particularly your background and the focus of the Simpson Center, get into agriculture, and maybe start by when we talk about the agriculture sector, and we've been talking about it as a fundamental building block of the economy. Exactly what are we talking about? How do we define the agriculture sector today?
The agriculture sector to date it's siloed. I think that's the best way to put it. And so there's the grain producers, and there's the cattle producers, and there's the barley producers, and there's the everything. And so anybody who ever tries to get something to get done, they don't like what's going on. They make another silo when they start. And I was accused of this with the Simpson Center. And I said, so it's not the intent of the Simpson Center to become the umbrella group and unite all these people, but it would be really nice to know how big this is.
Yeah.
And so we did a search in 2020, and we think that agriculture in Canada is 132 billion in GDP.
What percentage of GDP would that be? Or you figure?
I think it's close to 10%.
Well, and John, though, isn't it true? Like you mentioned, it's siloed that way by commodities and whatever. Isn't, and Marco's heard me on this ad nauseum. Isn't it also there's an agriculture producing sector, but there's an agriculture manufacturing sector on top of that. There's an agricultural service sector on top of that, and there's an agriculture knowledge and technology sector. I was riding on an airplane a while back ended up sitting beside an executive of the John Deere company, and he told me that at some future date, I can't remember that date, the biggest asset of that company will not be those factories producing the green machines. It will be the data that is being collected off those machines all over the world and connected to a particular point on the earth. So isn't it true that the agriculture sector is a lot bigger and more fundamental than a lot of people who just think of it as the producing sector, whether it's grain, whether it's cattle, whether it is?
We seem to have a kind of 19th century understanding of agriculture still in Canada, that it involves farms, that still use animal power. That's sort of the quaint understanding that many many city people still have. They don't realize that it is a sector that is highly powered on tremendous high tech and enormous amount of investments in innovation.
It's the standard. The standard comes out as beef. Beef is almost 10 billion. Canola is 9 billion. Wheat is 7 billion. Pork is 4.5 billion. And pulses are 2 billion now. That's in Canada.
And that's the producing sector.
Yeah,
that's
just
the
production.
producing sector.
That's just the producing
Yeah,
sector.
yeah.
It doesn't have anything to do with making canola oil.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
doesn't have anything to do with making bread.
Yeah.
So
But you wouldn't be able to make the bread if you didn't have the producing
So
sector.
that's why this 132 billion is the biggest guess we've got. I think it doesn't include equine, it doesn't include dairy, it doesn't include sheep, it doesn't include manufacturing, it doesn't include this new technology and infrastructure. So we've decided we're going to do a paper on to try to figure out how big this balloon is.
Well, that would be very crucial, I think, because I don't think the public, and certainly a lot of the policymakers and the politicians, understand the magnitude of this particular resource sector.
Yeah, it's 7.4% of the GDP. So
The measurable part.
the measurable parts that you're talking about.
We say we know about it.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's probably double that.
Yeah,
Yeah, very likely.
It's probably double that.
Okay, well, let's shift it. That's something, and somebody's got to persuade Statistics Canada or the National Economic Accounts to present the true magnitude of these sectors. But let's move on now to what are, if you had to be pinned down as to what the major concerns are of the agriculture sector right now, particularly concerns with respect to public policy on agriculture, where would you start? What would you say?
We start at the point where we need to stop exporting our raw materials. And we need to start producing canola oil in Taber, not in Vancouver or not in China. And producing and extending the production of all of our agricultural products in Canada, in Western Canada. And what the beauty of all of that is if you turn around and you put a $100 million canola plant, manufacturing plant in Taber, that the town of Taber will be revitalized. And we'll get people, young people, back at work, living in Taber, educating their children in Taber, and start to rejuvenate our rural community, which is dying. Because no one's staying on the farm. They don't want to work that hard. Most of them can't find a job, so they go off to get educated and become something else. And that's okay. But we need to have a rural system that can produce all this. Our job as Canadians, because we have this huge bread basket, is feeding the world. And we have all these people that are prepared to do that.
What's preventing that? What is basically what you're talking about in a way is moving the city back to the country, like the manufacturing end, the knowledge end, the technology end is in the cities, but you're almost talking about moving that back into the country. But what's preventing that from happening now?
The products, the raw products, are all going to Vancouver, or they're going to Toronto, or they're going to Houston.
Why aren't they being
the way it's been done? And there's no investment program set up by any of the governments to turn around to put some seed money up. We tried for 2 or 3 years to get the provincial government to put, so let's say it's cost $50 million to build a canola plant. If I've got 25, why can't I go to the province and get a favorable loan from the province and buy them out as fast as I can and get a canola production facility going on?
Private sector can't do it on its own.
It doesn't seem to be able to. And our competitors that are doing it are in Manitoba and Saskatchewan.
Sounds, and it is, one of the issues that Canada suffers from is lack of investment. And there is underinvestment in agriculture across many different fields, but in agriculture specifically, there is a serious thirst of capital to develop agriculture in ways to transform the raw materials, in ways to use greater technology. This is right now a big choking point in the country.
And your feeling is that a portion of that has to come from the public sector.
Well, it's coming from the public sector in our competing provinces. So if you don't want to if you can't get any favorable financing in Tabor, and you move to Brandon, and you get this favorable financing, doesn't matter. Most of the canola is grown in Alberta. It costs more money to ship it further away, but so the local places where it grows, it just makes a tremendous amount of sense to do that. But you go talk to a political person about the importance of agriculture in Canada, they don't get it. They haven't got this big number in their head that says that agriculture is that important for the rest of us.
And that's almost the point we started at, this necessity of convincing people that these resource sectors are not sort of relics from the past or something out there, that they are fundamental building blocks, and this is the importance of them.
There's a series of representatives, both at the provincial level and at the national level, who come from rural ridings. We only typically get one of them to sit at the table as Minister of Agriculture or what have you. But it seems to me that these representatives have a greater sale to do around the table to their colleagues about the importance of rural life and rural production as well.
So there's room for a program to kind of equip and enlist rural members of parliament, rural members of provincial legislatures to
educate their colleagues.
Carry on this educational program. Well, turning around to we're always trying to say things positively rather than negatively. Okay? So if you were to talk about the aspirations, maybe it's the same thing, but maybe you could comment, like what is the aspirations of the agricultural producing sector? What does that sector, what would it like to do? What does it want to do in terms of the future if there weren't the limitations?
Well, let's go back to production. We could use in Alberta, we could use another major packing facility. There's an opportunity to have in that. It's a different game because you're working with two of the largest companies in the world, and they're pretty happy keeping everybody else out of that. But we could use that in Alberta. We could start to refine more products in Alberta to make, and I still come back to all that really does put a big packing plant in Oyen, and there's going to be a tremendous rejuvenation of Oyen, and I think that's almost more important than anything else if we can try to get this rural community going back together and getting the powers that be in Ottawa and in Edmonton to understand that we're not just an oil and gas economy, because we're sure trying to wreck that too, right? And as we continue to draw down on how much oil we can produce in their dreamland of having everything zero emissions, we're going backwards.
And is that aspiration actually out there? Like, do the rural communities, does the average rural producer, if we dragged in a rural producer here and asked him what's your aspirations for the sector, does that sector itself, do the rank and file people there aspire to have this bigger role, to add the manufacturing sector to the producing sector, to add the knowledge sector? Is that out there, or do rural people themselves have to get more on the ball in relation to that?
There's this new group called the Alberta Business Council, right? Business Council in Alberta, right? And they put together several committees, and I'm on the agricultural subcommittee, and that's got 15 or 18 people on it. You get in the room with them, and they'll give you lots of ideas as to how we can make Alberta grow our GDP, grow our products. And if we add some more water to that so we can grow more, we're going to just have more and more and more production. So yes, there are those people there. Take those ideas and move them up the chain up to Edmonton or Ottawa.
And is there any unity on this across the West? Like you've mentioned Alberta, and of course you're mainly Alberta based, but isn't Western Canadian agriculture, most of this applies to Western Canadian agriculture, period. Is there very much cooperation among the producers across the prairies particularly?
No. Because we're competing against one another provincially, right? To try to get these facilities to build, to get them to go. And get people like Nutrien trying to figure out where to put a new fertilizer facility, right? Well, guess where they're going to go? They're going to go to Saskatchewan, right? So there's literally, they're going to stay home and they're going to try to play with the government money they can play with in their province. So it's not I guess globally you could say there's unity in the idea, but it's very competitive in where it ends up because who's going to finance it?
Yeah.
Doesn't make sense.
That's a challenge. That's a challenge. Well, I guess one other issue that connects to this is and other people have referred to it as the rural-urban divide. That you got these resource sectors, let's take agriculture, is out there in the country. But the majority of votes today are in the cities. I think the statistics are 18% of the Canadian population is now considered rural. Over 80% is considered urban. So to get any kind of policy change that you got to get through a parliament or through a legislature on resource development, you got to convince for every one person in the country who may be in favor of it, there's 5 people in the city who don't have the foggiest notion about it. So how do you bridge this urban-rural divide? Because I think if one could, it would advance the kind of policies you're talking about.
I think one of the things that's happened as a result of our past 2 years of battling with COVID is that people are beginning to understand that groceries don't grow on shelves. And they're also beginning to understand that they know they want to eat beef once a week and they know how much that's going to cost. And they want to know more about the production and the capabilities of how everything's grown. So they're becoming more picky at what they're doing, but they're getting a better idea of what agriculture is all about. And that should help get the urban divide. It should help.
Yeah.
It won't resolve it. We still need to break the nut with the big politicians as to how big agriculture is and how important it is to our economy, and get them to understand that if they stop, one of the ideas that Trudeau came up with recently was to reduce the amount of fertilizer we have to use by 25%. Just a statement, we'll do that.
Just out of the blue.
Just out of the blue, without any consultation with what that would happen, what would that do to our GDP. Just that's an idea. Somebody told them that would be a good thing to do, right?
Well, this is one of the broader challenges. I guess we'll get into this need for balance. Like in the old days, you used to have an economic project and we didn't consider much about the environment. And then they started saying, well, you've got to do environmental impact assessments of every major economic activity. Now we've gone the other direction where we have these environmental protection measures, like Trudeau's statement about cutting back on fertilizer, with no economic impact assessment of those proposals. And if you had both, if you have the environmental economic impact assessments and economic impact assessments, then the government can find the balance. But if you just have one or the other, you get that kind of statement. Now, what can rural people themselves do? Well, you've mentioned one thing, to keep stressing the importance and the size of the sector, but is there anything else that rural people can do to establish better rapport with the city voter, with the city? I mean, a lot of people in the cities are retired rural people, eh? Or a lot of them today are still kids that have been raised on the farm but have gone to the city. So it's not that you don't have friends in the city.
Well, this is in reference to the opportunities that arise from COVID that you were mentioning, a certain kind of awareness from the consumer about where products come from and the necessity to have things maybe closer to where we live. The fact that more people are actually working remotely or have developed the capability to work remotely works better for rural, semi-rural communities to attract people to come and live there, because people are looking for quieter places to raise their families and whatnot. And if they can telecommute to work, there are greater opportunities in smaller places to attract greater numbers of city people. That raises the numbers, that raises the tax base, and that raises the number of votes that they can have as well. So there are maybe tiny, but significant opportunities to do that.
Well, maybe the question we can end up on, John, unless you've got some other things you want to add. One of the things I worry about, even with podcasts and all the internet discussion and Facebook and Twittering and tweeting, is that we talk about these issues. We talk about them ad infinitum, but we don't do anything. So there's somebody out there who's watching this podcast who agrees with 80% or 90% of what we've said here. But what can we tell them to do to advance this recognition of the fundamental importance of the agricultural sector? What can the average person out there who agrees maybe with 90% of what we're saying, what can they do as distinct from just talking about it?
I think I have a very good answer to that, but I just want to back up one little bit. The problem with the rural workforce is called connectivity. And until we get connectivity solved, Elon Musk is supposed to be coming to the rescue on that, so we'll have connectivity throughout the land. Some of these events that you go to and you're trying to listen to people from Oyen and you're trying to listen to people from Grand Prairie, if you're not in a room that's got fiber and is connected, you sure can't see them, you can hear them, but so connectivity is a big thing that needs to be focused on.
And technology is starting to facilitate that. That's partly your point.
Greater accessibility of bandwidth and connectivity to the internet backbone from rural communities in Canada. About still 15% of Canadians don't have that.
Okay, but to do something.
So to do something, and you had that question about to do something, and so I think it's pretty interesting because I believe that this John Simpson, if he was 18 again, and if he had the luxury of knowing and the wisdom that I've got over 70 years of life about agriculture, is what I would do is I would go to university, maybe in Edmonton, or I might go to Guelph or something, and I would get really, really, really knowledgeable about agriculture. Okay. And I would go and I would look at all of the places where there's opportunity, because it's the last frontier of industry that's got so much ability to expand. We're going to continue to draw oil and gas out of the ground until there isn't any. But agriculture doesn't have a limit. There's no limit to what we can do if we do it better and we get more people doing that. And there was a wise old man that said once, and I've always remembered this, opportunity knocks, and it knocks often. Sometimes it comes disguised as hard work. So you go pick that product that, say you want to be the guy that's going to build the world's biggest canola plant in Tabor, and go for it.
Okay, well, we want to thank you for sharing your wisdom with us, and we'd like to encourage people that are looking at this podcast to contact us if you yourself have ideas, either comments on what's been said or ideas as to how to communicate better the agriculture, in this case, as a fundamental building block of the Western economy. We'd be more than happy to hear those. So we're going to pause for a few minutes, and then we're going to deal with another natural resource sector, the energy sector.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, John.
There's a tremendous amount of great information on the website at the Simpson Center for people to go look at and to see what's happening in agriculture.
We've been discussing Canada West as a distinctive and unique region in the country. Canada West as a distinct society, if you will. And one of the fundamentals, as we've been discussing, is that the natural resource sectors are fundamental building blocks of the Western economy and the Canadian economy. They're not relics from the past. They're not things that can be bypassed in the future. And we've discussed agriculture as a fundamental building block, and now we want to turn to the energy sector as a fundamental building block of not just the Western economy, but the Canadian economy. And we have a guest with us who will enlighten us to a large degree on this subject. And Marco, do you want to introduce our guest?
Absolutely. Welcome, David. David Yeager is an author, an oil and gas writer, energy policy analyst, and the principal of Yeager Management Limited, which is an oil field services management company. David's recent book, which I happen to have here, is From Miracle to Menace. I recommend it. David is well knowledgeable in the oil and gas industry and many other aspects of energy. So, welcome, David.
Oh, thank you.
And where we want to start, David, is maybe with defining the sector. When we talk about the energy sector, and particularly the petroleum sector, exactly what are we talking about? And maybe I'll communicate one of our biases here. I have this concern that when we talk about any resource sector, but let's say the petroleum sector, the focus is always on the producing sector, that it's the producing sector. That's what a lot of people understand. But
Right.
there's a manufacturing sector on top of that. There's an energy service sector on top of that. There's an energy knowledge sector on top of that. There's an energy technology sector on top of that. And the total contribution to GDP from the whole is a lot bigger than what an awful lot of people think. But anyway, there's my bias. And you can take it away. Take it away.
Canada is, whether we ought to be or not, and it's possibly one of the best kept secrets in the country, is we're the 5th largest oil and gas combined producing jurisdiction in the world on a barrel of oil equivalent basis. The countries, and I think I can get the order right, but in order, they're the United States, and then there's Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. Actually, Iran is still a big producer because they produce a lot of gas. So that is there's a fact, and that is about 4% of the world's oil plus the natural gas. And so were it to disappear, this would be equivalent to a limited thermonuclear attack in the Middle East. I mean, it would be a huge cavity in the global supply chain and would have a huge impact on prices. We started diversifying. I mean, if you go back in history, Calgary went on natural gas in 1912. That's for the first time. The first petrochemical facility in Canada, where we were building things other than raw energy, was built in 1941 by Cominco, and it was building ammonium nitrate. At that time, it was for the war effort, but that was later turned into ammonium nitrate fertilizer. So we've been actually in the fertilizing business and in the petrochemical business. That was the first move. And then Celanese in the 50s, when we discovered we had lots of oil and gas, built the first petrochemical plant to build fabrics like rayon and nylon and so on. So that started in the 50s. And that was, then of course, on the refining basis, refining has generally been located where it is. The other thing we started out when we started in the business was the oil services sector was largely imported at that time. Pretty well all the rigs and equipment and know-how we came out from the States back at that time. But that was an area where the serial entrepreneurs of Western Canada took over. And one of the best kept secrets is the length of the size and breadth of the oil services sector. And this is companies like Precision Drilling now that have rigs all over the world, and companies like Ensign Drilling. So we have been a manufacturer and exporter of value-added technological solutions for the global extraction industry for some time. And this moves on. There's the petrochemical business that started up in Sarnia with local oil and gas. But of course, they got a pipeline to that built as quick as they could. Imperial Oil has really started out in 1949 with tankers, and they put in the Line 5 we hear so much about in 1953. So we have been supplying the country with oil and gas. So what we did, when I was the chairman of the Petroleum Services Association in 2010, at that time, we had another made in Alberta problem with royalty reviews because people didn't really understand the breadth and size of the business. So we went down the supply chain where we looked at upstream oil and gas, and then we went down not the obvious supply chain because Statistics Canada data is really not particularly useful. they have one big bucket for resource extraction. So they put oil and gas, mining, fishing, and forestry in the same category. And the fishing business, as you know, on the prairies isn't what it once was. So anyway, so you really have to peel back the onion and go into the subsectors. But what we did, I worked with the Canadian Energy Research Institute at that time, and we went down the supply chains of all the other things it takes to produce this volume of oil and gas. And this, everything from pickup trucks to cable to plumbing and valves and steel. I mean, the Canadian oil and gas was big enough so that Algoma Steel put in at Sault Ste. Marie, they put in a casing plant back in the 50s. And so if you actually look at the whole thing, it is way, way bigger than you imagine. And we try to say that. You'll find the Prevost Bus Company in Montreal, their biggest customer was the oil sands for a long time, hauling crews out to the oil sands. And so they try to do this all the time to point out how integrated the oil and gas industry, supporting the oil and gas industry, and producing 8 million barrel oil equivalent a day. That's why we're number 5. That's the BOE equivalent coming out of Canada, mostly Western Canada, a little bit offshore Newfoundland. We try to explain this to people, where their jobs come from, and those who are affected directly tend to pay attention to this sort of thing. So it is, I have no idea how I can't fathom how Canada would be where it is today had we not had this incredible industry since the 19th.
Is there a reliable figure on what that total contribution to GDP is from the entire sector, not just the...
It changes so much. This is the problem. It's a point in time number, depending on reinvestment and so on. But every time I've looked at it, the only non-public sector industry larger in the country is residential housing.
Really?
The second largest private sector industry, the largest resource sector by any measure. When we looked at this data, again, we're using data from a decade ago, and things do change because of the reduced reinvestment ratio. But at that time, on a GDP basis, oil and gas was materially larger than mining, agriculture, automotive, forestry combined by a large margin. And so I look at the phasing out and the just transition, and it's just aspirational.
So what if you add the oil sands into that? Where do we stand? The oil sands is what, the second or third largest deposit of?
It is I believe, depending.
Second or third?
Number 2, I think Venezuela claims in the Orinoco Basin they have more oil in place, but the actual largest deposit of oil, second largest deposit of oil, and this is recoverable barrels. This isn't all the oil. This is just the number that they came up with, 174 billion or something, when the SEC, they changed the classification of what was oil sands. So they call it commercially recoverable. So the second largest commercially recoverable deposit of petroleum is the oil sands in the world.
We want to get into storytelling, but I don't think many Canadians know why that first plant was built. That first plant, the Great Canadians plant, was built by the Sun Oil Company.
It was, yes.
J. Howard Pugh.
Yes, yeah.
And Pugh used to rent the Point cabin at Jasper Park Lodge. He was 79 when he first came up here. Clarence Thayer, his chief engineer, was 78. These two old guys came up, and they were going to build the first commercial oil sands plant. And he used to, and my father was premier at the time, and so he used to go out and meet with Pugh at the Point cabin. I went along a couple of times. And the first time I ever heard the phrase, this would be 1962 or 61, somewhere around that. The first time I heard the phrase continental energy security, or he used North American energy security, was from Pugh. And I used to raise this question with students at the university. So why do you think Pugh was up there? And of course their standard answer was he was up there to make money. I said, no, wait a minute, the guy was one of the wealthiest people in the United States. He was 80 years of age. He just turned over all his fortune to that Pugh Trust to do charitable things. No, what he was up there for, the Pugh family made their money through the Sun Shipbuilding Company, which built tankers for the First World War and the Second World War, and Pugh was an authority on how many of those tankers got sunk. And he had it in his head that North America was vulnerable strategically and militarily from an energy standpoint. He was going to go find unconventional oil sources, and he was going to develop them. That's why the guy was light years ahead of his time.
Yeah.
But he saw that resource as not just a resource to produce gas for your car. He saw it as contributing to North America's energy security, something that the continent and the U.S. and Canada needed, which is lost. I don't know if anybody knows the story.
Well, when I was researching the history of the oil sands for the book, I discovered that the first samples, it was oozing out of the banks, right?
Yeah.
So
Alexander Mackenzie?
Absolutely, and ponds and so on, and they would go along. They would go out and look at this goop, and they sent samples back through the trading post back to Britain in the late 1700s. Was when the first actual samples of this goop went back, and of course, what got the first people that became interested at the turn of the century were the British, because they knew about this deposit of oil, and their interest turned up. Because if you recall, the Middle East, when they discovered that oil, they discovered that oil was so much better than coal for powering warships. So that's when they got out the survey transits and carved up the Middle East. The only part of the world that's got borders like Western Canada is the Middle East, thanks to British surveyors and survey transits. We'll call this Iraq, we'll call this Iran, we'll call this Alberta, we'll call this Saskatchewan. But anyway, their interest was rekindled for security of supply, military security of supply. Yeah. And this was the first political interventions into oil. When I started writing about the politics of oil, was again the Middle East and warships, and then of course came
security.
Then there was security supply, domestic security supply after the Second World War, and of course it was still a security supply issue in the 70s, because of course after they got GCOS going, along came Syncrude, and of course security supply was again an issue because of the Middle East. And again, this has been forgotten until they got security of supplies alive and well in Europe right now. They're turning the lights back on to this issue that's been sort of forgotten in an energy surplus of the last few years.
Well, we could tell a lot of stories on this, but let's go on to what are the current concerns with respect to the energy sector and the petroleum sector? Like, if you had to identify the biggest single concern of that sector, and that Canadians ought to be concerned about, what would it be?
Well, I guess speaking for the industry, the policy gyrations or the policy dynamics of the past 7 years have been breathtaking. There was, first of all, there was the oil price collapse of late 2014. And so the price went way down. And of course, this changed a lot of factors. And then along came the politics of carbon and pipeline opposition. And then along came the Liberal administration, the NDP legislation. And there was market access obstruction, of all things, that pipelines were declared that this was where the environmental movement felt that they could have the biggest impact in the shortest period of time. So the supply issue, the background noise of carbon taxes and the decarbonization, and this is not unique to Canada, it's just what is unique to Western Canada, is our geographic vulnerability. This is the interesting thing about Alberta, and what I call Alberta without oil is Manitoba with mountains. The reason 4.4 million people live here is not because of the weather or the beaches, right? The reason 4.4 million people live here and nobody lives in the neighborhood is simply because of the vast hydrocarbon treasure trove that's in Alberta. But I'd say today, if you were looking at what facing the industry today, some element of policy continuity, I would say, is the biggest single risk. What are you going to do next? We finally survived the oil price collapse. That was devastating. We survived the pipeline cancellations. Okay, fine. We got one piece of pipe in, and they're trying hard to build two more. We finally got commodity prices. The recovery in natural gas has had a way bigger impact than anybody really appreciates. This basin was built on gas, as you would know from your family history, Alberta Gas Trunk Line and so on. It was really gas that powered the basin, and then the oil sands came later. And so I would say today that the industry is too mean and too lean. If you look at the vacancy rate in downtown Calgary, there's been a lot of suffering to get the industry into a fine-tuned machine it is today. But what I have been saying is could you just leave us alone? Seriously, could you just pretend that that could you do something else for a while besides flog this not anywhere near dead horse? I mean, the industry finally has the cash flow. We have the incentive. The market is still there. There's been no dent in the global petroleum.
And your companies are a lot leaner, and
Yeah, the companies are they're lean.
their revenues this next year are going to be significant, and their costs are going to be significantly.
Oh, the cash flow from the ARC Energy Research Institute forecasts that the cash flow, the free cash generated from producing 8 million barrels of oil equivalent a day this year could be the highest in history if we don't get any curveballs out of left field. So the ability for this incredibly important industry to become masters of its own destiny is back and in a big way. The question is what's coming next? Will they leave this industry alone? Will they just say, okay, we've got the index carbon tax increases. We'll see. Everybody's got their head around that. I mean, okay, we say it's coming. We've got a program. We've got the clean fuel standard allegedly coming. We'll see. I think my own view is consumer pricing, consumer costs like food and inflation, I think will hopefully have a greater impact on public policy than waking up tomorrow and saying, well, the oil industry's still there. It ought not to be. I think also Ottawa's fiscal situation may be at the point that they're starting to realize that, having something in this country that just barfs out enormous quantities of cash, for taxes and for payroll deductions and corporate taxes and royalties. I mean, maybe okay, what's the biggest thing? If they would just leave it alone.
Do you think that, given what we have experienced in the last 10 to 15 years, it is likely that it would be left alone? The money is a significant issue, but there seems to have been no regard for the money that the industry contributes to the public coffers in the desire to see it curtailed or in some quarters even shut down. Because they're under this impression that there is this kind of unicorn that they call the clean tech industry that is going to replace entirely the oil and gas industry. I'm not saying that is the case. I'm saying that's what they believe.
One of the facets that I try to study is quantitative easing in the Western Canada. Like I've looked at the debt to GDP levels of the G7 countries from 2007 till present. And going into the 08-09 recession, the debt to GDP for the 7 G7 members was about 55%. And then along came the great financial crisis and the bazooka, and printing the money and the uber low interest rates. And they must have liked what they saw because they never stopped, even though the economy recovered in 09 and 010. They were still, so debt to GDP of the G7 countries by 29 pre-COVID was already up to 85 or 90%. Then along came COVID. And that was a situation where the governments did what they did, and they thought they could shut the economy down and turn it back on again, not really understanding the intricacies of the supply. So now we're in a situation where debt to GDP in the G7 countries, and some of them is over 100. So the point is, how much flexibility do we have as a nation? Mm-hmm. And so during this period from 09 to 19, this is when energy, especially after 15, energy was really cheap. After oil prices collapsed and gas prices were in the dumpster because of the shale boom. So we had possibly, in real terms, some of the cheapest energy in years. And if you go back in history, one of the interesting things about the 08-09 recession is they blamed that on the subprime mortgage market. They didn't notice that oil was at $147 a barrel in 2008, and the price of food in the Middle East was going through the roof, and all these other factors. So now we're in a situation where I don't believe the government has the flexibility. I think we're looking at the tapering in the United States. I mean, the Bank of Canada was on the record just the other day saying we're going to have to back off on quantitative easing. Everybody knows higher interest rates are coming. Food inflation is on everybody's mind. So you take that all back to this program. What do we produce in Western Canada? Well, fuel and food. And when inflation hits, you can live without a lot of things, but you can't live without either of those. And so I believe macroeconomics, the factors we're talking about here, inflation and interest rates, may add more, I'm trying to think of the right word, this is going to be broadcast publicly, more practicality, how's that, to federal economic policy than we get from a prime minister who admits by his own admission doesn't follow monetary policy. I think I think Ottawa's going to be.
And I guess it speaks to the center of what we're trying to do here, that this is fundamental.
It is.
It's not something that you can just simply dismiss. I mean, you can dream that it will disappear, but because it is fundamental, it is here, and it's not going to go away.
Well, apart from government just leaving this sector alone, are there positive things that, in terms of public policy, that the provincial or federal governments could be doing to greater recognition of this fundamental role the sector plays and laying the foundation for a positive future, not a negative one? Are there positive things that they could be doing other than leaving everybody alone?
Well, leaving it alone after beating shall continue till morale improves. After 7 years of taking it on the chin, from the oil price to collapse to all the things that have been done, is leaving it alone in itself would be an improvement. But I think the world wants to decarbonize. I get that. I mean, this is the world can decarbonize. And one of the conclusions I came to when I looked at the globe, and I looked at world oil consumption, and I looked at who needs what, 7.9 billion people in the world, and I think we saw that at COP26 recently, where India said was soft on coal. Just the realities of managing 2.5 billion poor people that need energy of any kind. We have the enormous opportunity, and what I've said this many times. What I'd like to do to the young people of Canada, we could do this if somebody would listen. And this is something the West could take the charge on. Is instead of terrifying the next generation about climate, why don't we engage them? Why don't we have an honest discussion about climate change? I'm talking an honest discussion on a global basis that India and China are two of the greatest GHG reducers, and they're not going to live without energy, to win the next election here in Canada. Okay? Period.
Yep.
And so the point is, what should we do? The first thing we should do is have an honest assessment as a nation of what our contribution to global emissions is relative to the rest of the world, and understand you could to heck with the oil industry, you could depopulate Canada and not make a material dent in global emissions. You could shut the whole country down, it wouldn't matter. So the point is, what should we do? Well, what we ought to do is people should understand that what the greatest single contribution that could be made to greenhouse gas emissions is more efficient fossil fuels, more efficient in production, more efficient in processing, and more efficient in consumption. So if we could use the brains and the knowledge and the advantages we have in Canada, and engage the young people today, say we're going to save the world not without fossil fuels, we're going to save the world with fossil fuels. And we're going down that path a little bit in Calgary. We're seeing the innovations in carbon capture and storage and the adoption of hydrogen. Like, we're there. So I would like as a country, we should be proud of the fact we're in the business. And we should do what the industry has been trying to say for years. We should show the world how to be the best, most efficient, lowest carbon fossil fuel producer in the world, innovate with the new technologies, sell them all over the world, and make some money at that as well. That is in our grasp, and it's just, I can't believe that we can't even have the discussion as a nation. We can't even have the discussion.
Is that going to change?
I believe this bit of energy reality that we're going through on a global basis. I do believe that this post-COVID era is a turning point. I do believe that. When Francois Legault says we're going to block the Energy Saguenay LNG export project to Europe to save the climate, and in other parts of the world they're starting up coal plants again because they can't get enough natural gas. I mean, we could. I remember the first time I met you. I talked about years and years ago when you were just getting started with the Reform Party. We had lunch one day, and I talked about Canada's myopia that, we're within the whole world, our life, looking at our belly button, navel gazing with no sense of the world. So let's talk about the world. Yeah, we could change that. But there's the practical elements, and then there's the political elements. So hopefully and tragically, it's just early winter yet. It's getting cold in Europe, and we can't hide from the global news entirely here, and see what is really going on in Europe, which is part of the world we used to care about.
So you think that public policies that facilitated at least that kind of discussion and particularly aimed at the younger generation is probably one of the most positive things that
it is a completely one-sided discussion where climate change is awful, you're all going to die, don't have any children, the world has no future. It's just so depressing, and there's no reason to believe that. It's just not fair. And so people are waking up, and even in Calgary, you talk to people who've got kids in university. It's even in our own city, in Western Canada. This cultural change, there's people that grew up on Al Gore's movie. My wife was a retired school principal for the Calgary Board of Education. She used to catch them slipping in Al Gore's DVD and calling it a lesson. We got a problem here. And I'm not suggesting that climate change isn't a problem. And I'm not suggesting that fossil fuel emissions aren't a contributor. The point is what can we practically do to contribute to the world, not just to Canada. And I do not believe that Canadian virtue signaling through economic self-immolation does anything other than perhaps, like I say, get votes in an election. It's tragic.
Well, another aspect that I think you've written on this recently is you've got this rural-urban divide in Canada, where I think 18% of our population now lives in the country, and over 80% lives in the cities. And the challenge, you've got these resource sectors, including the energy sector, the agriculture sector, is out there in the country. But the votes to get a positive policy in relation to those are in the city. There's 5 guys in the city for the 1 guy that's in the country. So how do you bridge this urban-rural divide to convince the urban voter and the urban consumer of their vested interest in the health of these fundamental building blocks? How do you cross that?
Well, there's 2 aspects to that. The simplest data is I pulled apart the 2016 census, which was, when I researched this, was the best one I could find. The 2021 census will be out again. But what I discovered is 65% of the population of Canada lives in urban centers of 100,000 or more, outside of the oil and gas producing regions of Canada. So I got the 4 western provinces minus the lower mainland, and 65% of the population lives in 85, and again, that's what I just described as 100,000 or more. And these folks do not really understand where anything comes from, nor have they had to, because they've never been out of anything. So where the gasoline shortages of the 70s that we might remember, but nobody remembers ever not going to the gas pump and not having that. Nobody remembers food poverty. That we've been disguising that with great government spending. So nobody's ever run out of anything. So when someone says that we can shut down the oil industry, and I've done many interviews on this, is that I don't believe that my family, my job, my friends, and my province should be an economic sacrifice so you can sleep better at night. On the climate issue. Yeah, I just don't think that's fair. So it looks like in the era of the internet, where everybody gets carefully managed streams of information and doesn't really have to follow anything that they don't have to hear anything that they don't want to anymore. All the studies have indicated that the papers that we grew up on, nobody knew who was reading it, right? So you had a little bit of everything in there. So you had to read about the baseball game and the deficit and the world affairs in the same paper. Now it's all streamed, so I can live on Kim Kardashian and NBA scores. I don't need to know anything else in the world. The only thing that's going to get to these folks is a bit of tough love, and that is when you go to the store and you economically. I don't believe there's any other way of reaching these people except the direction we're headed, where we're going to have to raise interest rates. The price of food is going to go up. It's on the news again today. The price of fuel is already going up. And then the Liberals are going to attempt to put the clean fuel standard and increasing carbon taxes on top of that. we'll see how that goes.
Let me push that idea a little bit. I was talking to Preston about this. Elizabeth Warren, we're going to pick an American example so that we don't get accused of too much partisanship in Canada, put out a tweet just before Thanksgiving saying that if you're wondering why the cost of groceries and transportation and all this stuff is going up, is because of the greed of corporations trying to bring their stocks up in price.
Yeah.
So the question is, I think that what you're saying is true. But on the other hand, there is this entirely different discourse that is going to sell the product of all this mismanagement and all this policy fiasco as somebody else's fault, and is already part of the narrative that oil industries and the agri-food industry and all these people are out to make money and nothing but.
Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, can campaign against running Southern Ontario and Montreal out of fuel without, and not bat an eye. I mean, not even, never even registers that as the governor of the state of Michigan, which has this incredibly open border with the United States. I mean, what a wonderful cross-border trade we've had in the auto business and all these things for years. And she looks around one day and says, well, I think, because of the Enbridge Line 6B, we should remember where this came from. There was a horrible oil spill in Kalamazoo River. And so it didn't just fall off the turnip truck. I mean, there are some roots in this. When you have modern politics devolved into a focused message on your supporters, and that's all that matters, facts don't matter. That's why that's why I thought the only thing that might change the channel on this debate would be economics, your wallet. Because this is what I talked about when I wrote the book. I went, I really wanted to, of all the problems that we grew up with, I remember as a kid growing up in Southwood, we had an air raid siren in a new neighborhood back in 1962, and they road tested it and blew all the windows out of the house, and then I would go, and I was in elementary, anecdotes, right? And I'd go to grade school at Harold Panabaker Junior High, which was just done. I was in grade 7. And they showed us movies of how when the nuke hit downtown Calgary, because Calgary was a target, right? Because it was the center of oil, that how if we hid under the desk, we could stave off nuclear annihilation by a nanosecond. We could live a nanosecond longer than my folks or grandma was in the upstairs at home, And so how did, we had the Vietnam War, my parents, I grew up grew up having to know about the Depression and the Second World War because my parents had lived through it. And we had all these problems, poverty, starvation, international wars. How did climate change get to the top of the heap? How did the weather become the world's greatest preoccupation? And it could not have happened without the internet. I mean, it three factors, really. One was a great book, The Progress Paradox. How come when the world is so much better, and it is by any measure, the world's way better than it ever has been. If you look at child mortality rates, you look at lifespans, you look at education, you look at poverty on a global basis, the world has never been better, and cheap energy has been the reason why. And yet first of all, you have to have a generation that never had tough times, that doesn't remember tough times, or we quit telling the stories around the campfire as our First Nations have done, and like you did, and we're doing here today, and you don't hear those. And then you get this incredible thing called the internet, the evisceration of the conventional media that would tell us what's really going on in the world. And it all comes together, and you end up in this bizarre situation where Elizabeth Warren you can be assured that those that vote for her are following her feed, and they'll do what they want because it's all tribalized and sliced and diced and prescripted. Yeah, so you go to the people that are going to keep you in office and you tell them what they want to hear. It's not your fault, not my fault. It is the old boogeyman going back for as long as we've been alive. J.R. Ewing, it's big bad oil. Always has been, always will be.
And you think that the only thing that's going to change that and bridge this urban-rural consumer-producer divide is just the reality of running out of something, and people starting to, and not accepting the politicians blaming everybody and everybody but themselves.
I keep thinking that modern monetary theory won't work.
Yeah.
I keep believing that debt has to be repaid. Now, we don't really repay debt, we just roll it over. But the point is that we've been through this remarkable period, going back to the end of 2009, where we've had uber low interest rates, and we've had nobody suffered, and unemployment. When in 2015, when Trudeau won the first time, the only part of the industry of the country that was doing poorly were those of us in the West who never vote Liberal anyway. In 2019, a little more reticent. In 2021, I think we're still in the COVID era. I think that the ability of governments to disguise the true performance of the economy, which is what we've been doing in the G7 countries for the last, I think I think the ability of the governments to keep cranking up the printing press and disguise the cost is going away. And as history has proven, when if you go back to the history of Alberta premiers, the popular ones were there when the economy was doing well, whether they had anything to do with it or not. And the politicians that did poorly were the poor guys like Don Getty that got the keys after oil prices collapsed and go through, Klein caught the gas boom, looked pretty good. And the ones after that didn't look so good. And I think we're going to find that will be the cross to bear of the current administration. And I think it's going to hurt really badly. And it's too bad it has to be this way. But.
Well, one thing we want to end up on, and I worry particularly in the internet and Facebook era of us substituting discussion, endless discussion, talk about our problems and what can be actually done about them. So if you had, like we have people watching this podcast who probably agree with 80-90% of what we're talking about, what you've said here, but what can they, is there any practical thing that they can do to push things in more in the direction that you're talking about? What can they do as distinct from just talking about it?
I was reminded of the MacDonald Commission in 1985. It was a Royal Commission under the Mulroney administration. I think leading up to free trade. Because you remember, in the free trade was a great thing. What are we doing? What are we doing? And
it's existential.
Oh my God! We're gonna buy and sell things with our closest neighbor. God help us all. So we went. I remember one. It was anyway. But what? And I've been trying to answer that question myself. And I think the West, and maybe this interview should be a catalyst. We should get the major industries in the West. We should get the major trade associations that represent these industries. We should get the labor unions that are employed by our major industries. And we should have a non-political Royal Commission into our own future. And don't invite the politicians. Just sit down with the people who live here, all the stakeholders. Get the forestry industry, the agriculture in there, the clean tech sector, the affected unions, even the public service unions. Just not the politicians. And say, who are we? What do we do? What pays the rent? What's going on in the world? And I think if you got this done with the right people dedicating the time of effort, it would take a while. It would be very, very difficult not to keep that undertaking off the front page, in my view. This big picture thing, and not just the private sector thing. Academia. Let's invite the major universities to participate. Their economic departments and so on, and let's talk about why we live here, what we do, what the world is doing, how we provide the things the world needs. And you asked me? I just an idea.
Another commission that it was further back than that, but almost had this profound impact, was the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism back in the 60s, which which laid the foundation for defining Quebec as a distinct society.
Sure.
So what about the Canada West Commission that defines the West as a distinct society and then addresses these our distinctives tend to be more economic. They're not social cultural so much as they, but address the challenge is that both of those commissions were initiated and got their status from governments. Do you think you could set up a Canada West Commission that had enough status and clout that it wasn't endorsed by the governments and the politicians?
I don't think there's any choice. I don't see how you're going to get anything done without depoliticizing it. I mean, you can't take, modern politics and people, we have the statistic, the current federal government has the support of 20.3% of the Canadians eligible to vote. There's never been more done with less. Never has and then it goes to Paris or goes to, on these UN climates, Copenhagen, Tokyo, they all run together. Then he goes to Glasgow and tells us what he's going to do to the most important resource industry the country has. And China, the people that they don't care, India doesn't care, nobody signed up for it. And how do you get it back in a peaceful way, in a useful, peaceful way? And so what are the chances of this government investigating itself with a royal commission? Zippo. I mean, none, not a chance.
And you don't think the 3 or 4 Western provinces could ever get together and commission such a commission?
You can certainly ask them. I think Alberta and Saskatchewan would jump in.
I like the idea very much. The issue is who has the summoning power outside government. Because do you remember the economic summit that Alison Redford summoned years and years ago?
Yeah, another great report that never saw the light of day.
And that's what I mean. I guess I'm saying that I share your sentiment that getting all the politicians in the room invites a kind of campaigning and a kind of conversation that distracts from the actual.
I see CAP. I see the grain growers. I see the perhaps the industry trade associations. But you have to invite academia. You have to go you have to go to the universities and you have to go to the trade unions. And
call it the Canada West Commission, but it's a non-governmental sponsored.
It would be structured in a way that this is the citizens of Western Canada frustrated at the direction of the country. We need to find a way to speak for ourselves. And this is what I'm going to focus on writing about. I was supposed to be writing another book. I ended up back in the oil service business, helping out my brother-in-law with a new technology. I'm actually in the business of shutting off methane leaks from old oil wells. So I turned green as a senior citizen, which is fine. It's good. It's good work. The world needs it. We're going to make a boatload of money. That's not the point. The point is that how do we, when looking at all of this, I think there's enough anxiety. And I think and maybe the provinces would participate. Maybe
give them a chance, but don't
certainly ask them.
Don't stop if they don't.
Well, no. If they declare that, I would start. The germ of it would start with the major. So and this could be the restaurant association. The hotel associations, the transport people, the truckers, the people that are just out there every day trying to make a go of it in this incredible onslaught of public policy that just doesn't make any sense to anyone who's not running for public office.
I think one very concrete suggestion that's come out of here is this idea of a Canada West Commission of some sort that addresses these and is not politically tainted, but it gets to the real core of
there's a lot of ingredients floating around out there that are looking for a home. There's a lot of different initiatives going on. None of which the Canada West Foundation and all these other people that are doing all little slices of this. But let's take the spaceship to 30,000 feet and
Okay,
become masters of our
okay.
destiny.
Well, we want to thank you, David. We want to thank folks that have viewed this podcast. We want to invite you to invite your friends to visit the website, thewesternstory.ca, and give us your comments, give us your donations if you have any, and give us your own thinking on some of the ideas that have been discussed here. And then we intend to carry on with some additional podcasts. We want to take a look at the other natural resource sectors as building blocks, the mining, fishery, and forestry sectors. And then we want to get onto these subjects of unobstructed transportation corridors and maybe flesh out this idea of a Canada West Commission that could advance the positive aspirations of the West. So thank you for joining us. We hope you'll join us again.